We're in this series right here called The Human Experience, an exploration on how to be human. It's been, I don't know, week 4 or 5, whatever we're in, but last week we kind of started a little bit of a dive into specifically talking about emotions. And there's lots of things we're asking about them. Can they be trusted? Are they reliable? Can we feel them without being controlled by them? Are there good and bad emotions? When you talk about emotions, most people talk about there being 7 basic emotions and then all kinds of other emotions that spur out of these 7 basic emotions. I'll give you them. There's joy, um, anger, sadness, fear, surprise, contempt, and disgust. All right? And what a lot of psychologists say is that all other emotions kind of birth out of these 7 fundamental emotions. So we've been talking about these emotions, and last week we talked about the fact that we live in a culture, it was very basic last week, but the idea was we live in a culture that doesn't know what to do with emotions because no one ever taught us what to do with emotions. And it's my hope at Vinings Lake, this is my desire, that that we collectively together become known as a very emotionally mature collective, all right? If there are a lot of things I hope are said about Vinings Lake. I hope it's said about Vinings Lake as, God, those people love so well. But I also hope it's true that what people say about us is, I hope we get a reputation of being emotionally mature people. I'll tell you what I don't want, a reputation of being emotionally immature people. You know what I'm talking about? What I don't want is for us to be known as people that are like, oh, they're a part of the Vinings Lake Collective. They're the people that write on social media and have no filter, all right? You know what I'm saying? No. It's my hope that they're like, there's some deep sense of compassion about this group of people. And they seem to know how to handle their emotions. Now, last week, the whole talk was about giving you and I permission to feel our emotions, all right? That's it. Very simple, but you're profound because we live in a culture that tells us not to feel our emotions. For many of us, we kind of grew up this way. I know I did growing up in the evangelical church. I was taught in many ways to ignore my emotions because they couldn't be trusted, they weren't reliable. I was taught to bottle my emotions. I was even taught to numb my emotions, and many people did. This is why I believe addictions are so prevalent, because we don't know what to do with what we're feeling, and so ultimately, whatever that is, you come home after a long day of work, and you have this feeling in you, and you're like, I don't know what to do, and so in an attempt to numb it, you medicate. And this is perhaps why we lean on alcohol so much, is because we don't know what to do with them. We don't like the feeling, right? And I'm telling you, we don't have to numb our emotions. We don't have to ignore them. We don't have to bottle them. We don't have to minimize our emotions. We don't have to deny our emotions, and we don't have to apologize for our emotions. I can't tell you how many people I know that are like, start crying and like, I'm so sorry. Stop apologizing. No, these emotions are welcome. We are free to feel and express whatever it is we are feeling in the moment. To feel is to be human. So the question is, are we comfortable with only particular kinds of emotions? It feels like in our culture there are emotions that are acceptable to talk about, and then there are those that are not. And sometimes, even without being aware, some of us are like, we don't do sadness here. We may not openly, explicitly say it, but it's kind of the vibe. Or we don't do anger here. All right? And the idea is, no, what if we had permission to feel what we feel? Because here's what we learned last week. Jesus certainly did that. I mean, all throughout the Gospels, you can point at places where Jesus was sad, Jesus was angry. You can point at all these places where Jesus felt disgust, where Jesus felt certain things. And it seems to me that Jesus actually feels them, like all the way. He goes into it and he allows the feeling to emerge. It's what he does. And it's in that moment that Jesus kind of gives us permission, like, yeah, that's what it means to be human. Of course, you have feelings, so feel them. Don't repress them, suppress them, deny them. Let them surface. Yeah. But as you do, you need to know this. There are no good and bad emotions. And last week, that was a huge step for many of us because for some of us, we still think in positive and negative. It's like we step back and we judge our emotions going, okay, Joy and positivity is good, but anger and grief is bad, right? Now, no one taught me. I wasn't like in school and they're like, kids, gather around. Let me tell you about good and bad emotions. No, it was just like cultural conditioning, right? It's like someone somewhere along the way, I picked up the vibe that, oh, anger, we didn't do anger in our church. Like anger, I remember our pastor used to say to us, and by our pastor, I mean my dad, he used to say to, he used to say to us, anger is not a fruit of the Spirit. You ever heard this? Like anger is a bad thing, right? And I remember one time we had Austin Channing Brown here. I don't know if y'all remember Austin Channing Brown. This may have been before this group. But Austin Channing Brown wrote a book called I'm Still Here, and she's just absolute fire. And I remember her coming into VL, and she just out loud saying, with what's happening in our world with race and white supremacy, and she's like, I'm angry. And I remember the shift happening to me going, yes, of course. That makes sense. But it's funny, like in white supremacy itself, it's like, no. It's like all of a sudden, it's like, we don't do anger. You know what I mean? It's like, wait, why? And then when you look at Jesus, they're like, well, anger's not a fruit of the Spirit. But then you look at Jesus and you're like, well, Jesus certainly seemed to be angry on multiple occasions. In fact, I'll read one to you this morning where Jesus is actually angry. It's interesting. But it's almost like we picked up this idea, at least I did, anger was like a negative emotion. So I could name some negative emotions. Anger was one, grief, sadness. Now they're like, well, sadness happens, but just keep it short. It was always interesting to me how people, when it comes to like grief or sadness, they understand it at like a mental level. They're like, yeah, you're going to experience that. But then they get really frustrated when it goes longer than they think it should go. Do you know what I mean? It's like, God, it's just, you're so sad. It's time to move on. You ever had someone, I know you lost your loved one, but it's been 27 years. It's time to move on. First of all, I would say this to you. You don't get to decide how grief operates in another person's life. We can agree to that, right? We don't get, and here's the thing I would say to you. If it bothers you that much, if someone else's emotional existence bothers you so much, then you need to stop and ask yourself, why is it bothering you that much? Because it's not their problem, it's yours. And the thing is, for many of us, we just set these ideas in this category of negativity. And what happens is this enormous amount of pressure in our culture, especially the West, American culture, positivity. The power of positive thinking, people. I just need you to get up in the morning and put a smile on your face. It's a brand new day, folks. My name is Pastor Joel Osteen, and we're going to live today to the fullest capability that we have. Let's turn that frown upside down. And there's nothing wrong with that per se, but I'm going to tell you something. If you keep telling us that positivity is the only emotion we can have, let me tell you what that's going to produce: inauthenticity. A whole bunch of people walking around like AI robots going, we can't feel anything. And that's not humanity. I'm saying, what if you just felt what you have permission to feel? So here's what we learned last week. There are no good and bad emotions. Let's leave that category behind. Besides, why are we even judging our emotions? What we learned from Susan David, who wrote Emotional Agility, she's a Harvard professor. I recommended that book last week, recommend it again. If you are a parent, it is a must read, all right? In fact, people that I know that are having babies, this is the book I bring them, all right? It's like, oh, you're having a baby? This is mandatory reading, all right? And what she said, I love this. She said, it's not that emotions are good and bad. Emotions just are, all right? Now, I'm going to take a step further and say this. There are no good and bad emotions. However, I think if we're accurately trying to describe what it is when we say good and bad emotions or negative and positive emotions, I think what we're really saying is there are comfortable and uncomfortable emotions. And therein lies the difference, because we live in a culture that doesn't know what to do with certain emotions, and so we're uncomfortable sitting in that space. And so I can't tell you how many people I meet that are like, oh, God, that person's angry. I need positivity. I'm out. What would it look like for us just to sit in that for a minute instead of trying to rush people to the emotions that we deem as comfortable. And then we have to ask larger questions. Why are certain emotions uncomfortable for us? Have we been raised in a culture that's conditioned us in certain ways to not sit in those emotions and actually feel them all the way through? Now, let me read this to you today. And now, because some of you are like, great, last week was wonderful, permission to feel, right on. But Pastor, I know people, it's just gone overboard. They not only have gotten the permission slip to feel, but they feel a little bit too much. You know what I'm talking about? Do you know anyone who's over emotional? All right, and don't point fingers, and that was a rhetorical question, so please don't holler names, all right? Maybe you're here and you're like, I got a child, they're going into the teenage years. Oh my God, it is an emotional roller coaster at my house, right? Some of you, and just hang with me, some of you may feel this too. Some of you may feel this. Imagine living in one of the greatest countries in the world, and then imagine the leadership of that country not knowing how to also control emotions. Okay, Kevin's back, thank you, all right. So you can't just say, oh, this talks for teenagers. They get over emotional. Oh, come on, let's not fool ourselves. I know plenty of grown adults who do not know what to do with their emotions. And when I say that, I raise my hand going, I have had my moments. Perhaps you have too. I was on the golf course 3 weeks ago with my buddy Ben. I'm down in Peachtree City. And I have been with this coach of mine for a while. His name is Ted. He's a fantastic human. And Ted has taught me pretty much everything I know about golf. I love this coach. I see him about once every 2 weeks if I can. And he's not only a coach, he's a therapist. So he is my new therapist, all right? And I see him, I get my head straight, my mind straight, my game straight, everything straight. You know what I'm talking about? Love this guy so much. In fact, when I go play golf, I breathe in his energy. I'll even tell the people around me, like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm meditating, leave me alone. I need that Ted energy. You know what I'm talking about? Ted energy is what I call it. Give me the Ted energy, right? And I love it. So what happens is when you do that, your expectations begin to rise because you start actually getting halfway decent. So every time you go play, it rises and rises and rises. And I went out with my buddy Ben, and it just wasn't happening. And I'm like, no worries. Ted's taught me how to handle moments like this, okay? I know what to do. You go back to the basics. I start checking things. I'm like, it's not a problem. And then it just kept being a problem, and I couldn't figure it out. And I'm like, should I call Dr. Ted in the moment, live in the game, going, I need help, and put him on video, like, can you dissect what's happening? You don't do that in the game. You either have it or you don't have it. And so finally, by the time I finished the front nine, and if you know anything about golf, it's like you finish the front nine, and it's a new nine. So it's like, all right, that nine's behind us. I'm going to put it away. I mean, the best way to recover from this is how quickly can I recover? Watch this. You're about to see Ted energy. And I'm like, Ted energy, come on. And I get up, and I shank the first drive off of 9. And let me tell you what I did. I have never done this. I'm embarrassed by this. I got so angry. I mean, first of all, it's a golf game. This is a golf. It's all ridiculous. Life is ridiculous, but this is really ridiculous. It's like, I mean, talk about like literally privilege at its best. I'm up there in my little, quarter vest, like, and I'm just like, angry because I could not hit a small white ball off of a thing. And I got so angry that I went, and I threw my driver. And Ben looked at me, he's like, I've never seen you that angry. And I just walked off to the cart. And I got in and I said, Ben, you just have to understand, I've spent X amount of money in lessons, and I can't play worth. And I just start saying words that I don't know what I was saying. And then there was a moment where Ben just hysterically just starts laughing. And he literally looks at me and he's like, you're the most ridiculous human I've ever met in my entire life. And then I start laughing going, it is all pretty ridiculous, isn't it? It is. And then, of course, Ben is the type of guy, he'd poke at me, and he'd be like, let me ask you something. Have you ever been that angry about injustice? I'm like, get out of the cart. Get out of the cart. Get out of the cart. You know what I mean? He's poking at me like, oh, you seem to be more angry about this than you are. Okay. All right. So when I tell you, we don't know what, like we don't know what to do with emotions. If last week we talked about permission to feel, what I want to do this week is I want to talk to those who who might be interested in this phrase, emotional maturity. I want to look at what emotional maturity might actually look like. Now, to get at this, let me read this story. This is in Mark chapter 3, verse 1. Here's a great example of Jesus and emotions. You ready? Again, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They were watching him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come forward." Then he said to him, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath? To save life or to kill?" But they were silent. And then check this phrase out. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at the hardness of heart and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him on how to destroy him. Now, last week we looked at this and we said Jesus experienced anger. It's one emotion of many that we know about Jesus experiencing. So, we have permission to feel. The question is this: if we're going to feel, is there a healthy way to feel and express those feelings? And is there an unhealthy way to feel and express those? We know we have permission to feel and express our feelings. The question is there a healthy and unhealthy way to feel and express our feelings? And if we're going to use the phrase emotional maturity, what might that look like? I would argue, and you don't see this all the time in the life of Jesus, I would argue in this moment right here, you have a great picture of what emotional maturity looks like. Now, I could also point you to a text where Jesus doesn't show emotional maturity, and you really see his humanity in that moment, right? But in this moment, what you find, I think, is a beautiful picture of emotional maturity. Now, what could emotional maturity look like? Here's what I would say. A couple thoughts here. One, in this moment, what you find is Jesus doing something phenomenal, all right? Jesus does not let his emotions dictate his behavior, okay? He feels his anger. The text says it. And he looks around at them with anger. But I want you to notice what doesn't happen next. He looks around at them with anger, but he does not approach them, hit them, beat them, push them, move them out of the synagogue. He just simply stands in his anger. He looks up, he eyes them. So he has this human moment where he's like, these guys. But he pauses. It's like he pauses. Now, we're reading Ism. It's like he pauses. And then something really phenomenal happens. There's a conversion or a converter that takes place. Because the text says he looks at them with anger, and then it says he was grieved. So there seems to be some emotional converter that happens from anger to grief. So it's almost like there is a space that happens between Jesus being angry and him experiencing grief. It's almost like his anger somehow begins to move into grief. But somewhere there's a space in the middle of that. And in that space, Jesus decides not to let his emotions dictate his behavior. Now, I'll just ask you a question. Have you ever met anyone who is controlled more times than you would care to admit by every emotion they feel? Have you ever seen anyone cause loads of damage because they are over-emotional, controlled by every single feeling they have? Have you ever met anyone who seems to be out of control? They are out of control, and what seems to have moved in the driver's seat is whatever emotion arises. I grew up with an older brother, and sometimes I wish I could make statements like this and we lived in a culture where I could snap my finger and be like, and here he is, meet my brother. You know what I mean? Because I would love for you to meet him. But I grew up with an older brother and older sister. And I learned something real quickly. the way families operate, and you probably know this, but children pick up different traits, and sometimes you can see it's bizarre how like DNA works, and just how like having children, like how it operates, because you can look at certain kids and you're like, God, it's like that person's a replica of their mother, but then it's like, were they adopted or was it a different dad? Because they don't look anything like you know what I'm talking about? Like you can look at kids and be like, well, that's kind of strange. So the thing you need to know, my brother and sister, I'm telling you, they picked up everything from my father. And somehow being the baby, I picked up everything from my mother, to which I would just like to publicly say, I won, all right? Because if you're going to pick up traits in my family, you're going to want to pick up the ones from mom, all right? Mom, like, doesn't look her age. She's got smooth skin. Katie says, like, your skin. I'm like, hey, just thank my mom, all right? My mom had some good skin, all right? Mom is very calm. Mom is just calm. Mom's an introvert. I mean, mom's just like, you know, she doesn't. Now, if you ruffle mom, she can get angry. And when she does get angry, it doesn't happen a lot, but when she gets angry, you better hope she doesn't have access to nuclear weapons. You know what I'm talking about? Because she won't hesitate. But that's mom. Dad, on the other hand, how do I say this because I'm not a therapist, but dad had what do they call that? An anger problem. Do you know what I'm talking about? Dad got angry a lot, and so what happened was my brother and sister got angry a lot. So you can imagine when you have two personalities that are very similar. So if you've ever had anybody in your family, like they just keep butting heads. Why? Because they're exactly alike. That's why. And so there's butting heads. So my brother, my sister, and my dad used to butt heads all the time. And my older brother, he never knew what to do with that. And so he would have moments where I knew, oh my God, and now here's the phrase I would say as a kid, he's losing it. He's losing it. I could see it happen. And then sometimes he'd lose it on me. Do y'all remember the movie Karate Kid? Of course you do. My brother and I grew up during Karate Kid, and someone bought us the headband. Do you know what I'm talking about? And when I would put on the headband, something would come over my body, all right? Like, I mean, I was Daniel. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like, I became Daniel. And if you don't know anything about Karate Kid, he does the whole thing like this. Well, one day my brother and I are out, and I can remember this moment so clear. My brother, he got angry about something, and he just went off. And he would always say, my brother would say this, after it was all said and done, and I'd come home with a bloody nose or something, Mom would be like, what happened? And he'd be like, I don't know. It just went black. And I'm like, did it? Did it just? He'd be like, I lost it. I just went off. I'm like, you went off? Like, what does that mean exactly? You went off. As if he left his body and his emotions completely took over. He just went off. Well, one day I just had enough, and there was something that he just went off on me, and he started beating me a little bit, and I was like, I'm going to have it. And so literally, he like beat me down, and I remember he started walking back to the house like, ha, 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 just whooped my little brother again. And I pulled out of my pocket that little headband, and I put it on. So help me God, I remember this moment. I put it on and tied it, and something came over my body, and I was like, oh, so my brother's walking back, and he doesn't know I'm sneaking up on him, and I snuck up on him. And I remember, and it probably didn't look near this good, but in my mind, it looked like I jumped in the air and went, pow, and kicked him in the back. I remember his back going, whoa, and he fell to the ground, and I literally jumped on him, and I was like, don't mess with me. Yeah. Now, if you ask my brother, he'd be like, that's a made-up story, all right? But here's the thing. I grew up in a home where it was like, oh, these siblings, like they'd have a moment. And I want to say something. That's actually totally normal for people coming into that age. Yeah, if you have a teenager or someone that's coming into teenage years, that's a part of parenting. You're helping them navigate these brand new feelings. They don't know what to do with them. They're like, I don't know, what am I supposed to do with this? And so you help them, permission to feel. Yes, feel that. But here's what could happen. In those moments, you could begin to teach them, yeah, that's called anger. I know. Sit with it. But also, you don't have to let that feeling dictate your behavior. Now, most of you in here would be like, yeah, that's kind of 101 humanity. I know, but check this out, all right? Gets better. This idea of not letting our emotions dictate our behavior, this is what most psychologists call, check it out, emotional maturity. That's it. See, some of you heard that phrase and you're like, I don't know if I can be an emotionally mature person. Or some of you heard it like, I'm already an emotionally mature person, all right? No. It's very basic. Emotional maturity is when you do not let your emotions dictate your behavior. I write it like this: emotional maturity is when you are able to experience an emotion without being controlled by that emotion. And there's something remarkable about what Jesus does here. He experiences the emotion of anger, but yet he isn't controlled by that emotion. So hold that nuance and that tension. When you live in a culture and you're raised in an evangelical world that says, do not feel anything, wrong. Feel it, but also hold this tension. You can feel that emotion without letting it dictate your behavior. And you might ask, well, why is that important? Well, there are many reasons. But here's one. The reason you don't want to be controlled by your emotions and your feelings, and hang with this, is because I don't know how to tell you this, and this may sound like the evangelical world you grew up in and I grew up in, because I've certainly heard it, but it's okay. There is some truth here that we need to lean into. You don't want to be controlled by every feeling, and here's why. Because not every feeling is reliable. Now, most of you would be like, yeah, I know that, all right? Listen to this. Feelings can be inconsistent at times. Do you know this? Feelings can be unreliable at times. Feelings can be very complicated, and feelings can be untrustworthy at times. Susan David, the writer of Emotional Agility, writes it this way. I think it'll be on the screen. Check this out. Our emotions are not always reliable. In some situations, they help us cut through the pretenses and posturing, working as a kind of internal radar to give us the most accurate and insightful read into what's really going on in a situation. Who hasn't experienced those gut feelings that tell us, this guy's lying? Or, something's bugging my friend even though she says she's fine. But in other situations, emotions dredge up old business, confusing our perception of what's happening in the moment with painful past experiences. You know this to be true, right? I have to tell you, there have been many moments where I have seen very clearly, oh, that feeling I had, it was actually wrong in that moment. You ever had that? I was so certain because I felt a certain way, and then got through it and got on the other side and I'm like, that feeling was not accurate. And then you go back and go, well, why was I feeling that? And you begin to realize, oh, that was about me and past experience, not the actual moment. I was projecting onto the moment things that had happened to me in the past. Yeah. And so, we can't be controlled by every emotion because the truth is not every emotion is reliable. And not every emotion is trustworthy. So it begs the question, then how do we navigate this tension? How does Jesus not let his emotions dictate his behavior? And here's what I want to give you, okay? And I hope you experience this. I hope you get it, like intellectually, but I also hope you experience this in your life. Somehow, Jesus doesn't let his emotions dictate his behavior, and here's the best shot I have at it. Because Jesus creates a space between his anger and his actions. Jesus creates space between who he is and what he is feeling. Perhaps you've heard people use this phrase, he responds, but he doesn't react. Perhaps you've heard this, right? Maybe you've even told your kids this before. Respond, he doesn't react. All I can tell you is this. It's like Jesus gets angry, and then there is this window. And I don't know yet if he creates it or if he just awakens to it. My hunch tells me is that he awakens to it, because it's been my experience that with every emotion I feel, to not let it dictate my behavior only happens when I pause, just pause, and I breathe, and I feel it, and then I recognize there is a space. And in that space, I get to make a decision. Will this dictate how I act or will it not? Viktor Frankl, he's an Austrian psychologist, Holocaust survivor, wrote a book that every human should read called Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl worded it like this. Tell me if this does not resonate with you. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. I want to pause here. This man survived the Holocaust. So we're not doing ethereal ideas here. This is some psychologist sitting up in his $5 million home going, let me help you guys out with your emotions. This is a man who literally was beaten. This is a man who was almost taken to death. And he watched thousands and thousands of people executed. And he says, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. That's it. And my hope for you is that you feel what you feel, but that you recognize between stimulus and response, there is a space. And may you find that space and sit in that space. And maybe some of you are like, never felt that space before. Whatever I feel, I just act on it, all right? Maybe, just maybe you can learn to create that space. Great example is there have been occasions where someone has angered me, all right? And there have been moments where they come from like past wounds or hurts, and I'm like, I want them to feel what I'm feeling. And so it's like you go to the keyboard and you're about to punch in your post. Well, imagine this, all right? Someone taught me this years ago. Most of you in the business world probably know this too. You've probably heard this 1,000 times. When you're angry, what if you write out what you want to say? I mean everything, unfiltered. Write it out. I do that all the time. I'm not going to go into detail, but Katie knows. I have drafts of email in my inbox that Katie has read going, oh, dear God, I'm glad you never sent that out. Now, some of you are like, I don't have time. Wrong. That's Chronos, okay? You got all the time in the world, all right? If you're here for that talk, you know what I'm talking about. Make time, all right? Here's what I'm saying. Try this. When you get that email, respond immediately, but don't hit the send button. So when you get it and you're like, write out what you want to say. And let me tell you something about me. I get really creative with my anger. Do you know what I'm talking about? Because what I think my weapon is my intellect. And so what I like to do is, I don't even like to be passive-aggressive with my anger. I like to body slam people with the intellect. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's my ego going, show them you're brighter, smarter, da-da-da-da. Because, why? Because deep down inside there's the insecurity that I'm not brighter. Okay, you get the point, all right? And so I get real creative with my emails. So like sometimes I'll get an email and I'm like, and then I'll be like, oh yeah, of course, because it's like total nonsense to me, but I'm like, somehow they believe that about me, which makes me angry. And so I'll get on and be like, yeah, of course, that's the way it is, da-da-da. And I'll just start writing things, and I'll start creating stories to show you how ridiculous you sound. Do you know what I'm talking about? All right, it's getting too personal, all right? And I'll do it immediately. I'll leave it. And then I'll wait. So before you hit the send, write it out. Here's a rule. Wait 24 hours. 24 hours. Make that your rule. I will not hit the send button for 24 hours. Yeah, but they need a response right now. You get to determine when they need a response, not them. So don't hit send. Sit on it. And then I challenge you to do this. After 24 hours goes by, don't read it. Send it to the person you trust the most. Hey, I was getting ready to send this email. Let them who isn't in the moment come in from the outside and show you how ridiculous that email looks. All right? Yes. So you get it out. You wait 24 hours. Now, what's in the waiting period? That space that Viktor Frankl says between stimulus and response is a space. And it's in that space that we get to decide, will we let our emotions control our behavior? And even if we do, which I think sometimes you should. Even when you do, the question is, how much will we let our emotions control our behavior? Yeah. And so somehow it's in this space that he recognizes who he is not what he's feeling. So maybe you've heard it like this. Susan David went on to say, when you say things like, I'm stressed, you conflate your whole self. I am equals all of me with the emotion. Be careful with our wording. I'm angry. In that moment, you are conflating your entire self with your emotion. And when you and I do that, we're giving too much power to the emotion. I'm stressed. I'm angry. I'm anxious. It may sound nitpicky, she said, but the very phrasing fuses your entire identity to the feeling of that emotion. And that's part of what makes the experiencing feel so suffocating to you and I. And so maybe we just shifted a little bit. She went on to say this, ask this question the next time you feel an emotion. Who's in charge here, the thinker or the thought? I told you recently what my therapist said, you don't have to believe everything you think. Mind-blowing moment for me. This is another mind-blowing moment for me. If you don't have to believe everything you think, I always stop in the moment and I ask this question. Who's in charge here, the thinker or the thought? Yes. You could phrase it like this. Who's in charge here? The one experiencing the emotion or the emotion? Because remember who you are. You're not just all emotion. You're not just all of your body. There is an awareness behind it. So you just pause and you say, yeah, who is in charge here? I sit in that space, and as much as my body's like, send the email, hit send, I'm like, pause. Who's in charge? Who's in charge? The I behind the emotion or the emotion? Let me break this down with parenting for a minute, okay? Are we good? Oh, come on. You guys have been great. I'm loving this. I'm so glad you're here. I mean, this is like cream of the crop, people, so I'm glad you're here. And emotional maturity is your thing. Just put it on your post. I am now emotionally mature, okay? Susan David, again, Emotional Agility, she wrote this. I keep referencing her because it's so good, but she wrote this about parenting. So I'm not a parent. I've made observations, but I'm not a parent. And here's what you need to know. I do have loads of kids in my life. We've got enough nieces and nephews that there's a reason Kate and I aren't parents, because we're going to have to help fund their education. And there's just so many, and they keep having them. And I'm like, I don't understand. And then it occurred to Kate and I recently, the reason they keep having them is because we keep helping provide for them. But anyways, do you know, like feeding the addiction? It's like, there's like, well, we've got 12 kids, but it's not a problem to us. Of course it's not, all right? And so as a good therapist, we're like, they need to start feeling a little bit of suffering. You know what I mean? But that's the whole thing. But so Katie and I don't have kids of our own, but it's interesting because we have so many around us, and this, it's a whole different perspective when you love a kid, but they're not your kid, because there's a sense of you can read and see things like real clear, but you don't really bear the weight and responsibility of it. And I love my nieces and nephews. They're amazing humans. I'm learning so much from them as we go, the way they see the world. All that said, if you've been a parent, you know this experience, but have you ever been anywhere where the worst case scenario happens, where you have a child and that child, for whatever reason, just loses it all in a public space? Do you know what I'm talking about? And you know, and I know this just as an uncle, all right? They call me Uncle Coco. I know this. Thank you. I know it's a good one. They chose it. It's a good one. But I know this. It feels like a reflection on me, doesn't it? And I'm not even the parent, but I'm the guardian in charge. So I'm out in public. So here's an example. You're out in public. And you ever seen a child have a meltdown? Like a full-on meltdown on aisle 3. I mean, just lose it. Just this week, I went into Publix. Just a little afternoon, walk in, grab a couple things for dinner. I saw a child lose it. Then I saw the mom lose it on the child, and I was like, oh, God. And the mom just went off on the child, and I was like, I don't know if that's helping. But then I was like, you're not a parent. You don't know. Hush. Mind your own business. And I'm like, here I go. Stop judging, right? And then literally I'm just, and the kid's just, bah! Just going nuts. And I'm just like, oh, that kid, feeling it right now. Feeling it. And I know we live in a world where it's like everybody's the master parenting, and it's like, oh, here's what you're supposed to do in that moment, get on their level, and da-da-da-da. And I know when you're a parent, you're like, sometimes that just doesn't work. Dude, trust me. By and large, why I'm not one, all right? But if you're not careful, it like feels like a reflection on your style of parenting, guardian, whatever. And Susan David writes this, and I absolutely love this, because if you've ever had one of those moments, and it's likely you have, sometimes it's like, wait, what do you do in those moments? How do you teach what we're teaching here today? How would one teach a child that there is a space between what they're feeling and their behaviors, and that they don't actually have to let that emotion dictate how they behave? Can a child even handle that conversation? I would argue, can adults even handle that type of conversation? So Susan David said this. I love this. She said, while raising emotionally agile children requires that you acknowledge and accept their feelings without rebuke, it does not mean you need to tolerate tantrums or irrational behavior. You can let kids know their feelings are real and just as important as anyone else's. Example, quote, I see you're really annoyed with your baby sister. And yes, I understand that right now you want to give her away. You can say that without suggesting every feeling should be acted on. This is where the stepping out comes in. She calls it stepping out of the emotion for a minute. Oh, I love that. So if you're feeling something, feel it, but then step out of it for just a minute, all right? She said, by helping your children or your child learn to label the emotion, gain perspective, and put, there it is, distance or space between the impulse and the action, you're reinforcing the idea that while they don't need to restrain their feelings, they do sometimes need to restrain their behavior. Wow. That's not for the kids. That one's for me. Yeah. Yeah. This should be a required quote for every person who gets a driver's license. Right there. Just the last line should be a requirement. Many of us should post this, put it on our windshields before getting on 285. While you don't need to restrain your feelings, you do sometimes need to restrain your behavior. Is there a greater example of how quickly one can go from 0 to 60 and let their emotions impact their behavior than in a moment of road rage? It is amazing how fast it happens. And if you think about how silly it is, they cut you off. And you take it so personally, as if it's never happened before. Or as if that person woke up today and said, I got one agenda today. I'm going to find that 98 Honda Accord, and I'm going to cut them off so bad. Yeah. I mean, this is easy to say up on a stage when things are okay today. It's hard in the moment. Katie knows. I've lost it every now and then. She's lost it every now and then. I'm not going to give examples because I didn't ask her, but I just said that and she's laughing because we might have had an incident recently. It might have been pulling into our neighborhood and we've got these gates and a thing happened and I just looked over and a side of Katie came out that I was like, oh, okay. We got something here, all right? Yeah. And here's the thing. For many of us, we're like, yeah, this is great. I want to teach my kids this. Here's the concern. Is when we live in a culture where even the leadership doesn't know this truth. And that's where, I'm not here to implement fear, but that's where it gets a little terrifying for me. And this is why I like lowest level. If a leader doesn't know how to practice emotional maturity, they would never receive my vote. Forget the policies. People are like, let's talk policies. I can't even get to policies. I can't get to policies because I see someone who doesn't know anything about emotional maturity. You're like, how do you know that? Because I've seen the tweets. And all that person is immediately being controlled by their emotion, going, I feel this way, boom, I'm going to act on it. I hate Taylor Swift, exclamation point. Now hear me. I know it's easy for us to be like, oh, this is cute, just pick on him a little bit. I know there are people in here that love the man, all right? Now I want to just say this. I don't care. I'm not interested in that. What I am interested in, hear me well, is there is a big red flag when a leader, a grown man, in quotes, cannot control his emotions. I get real nervous if you were to tell me, put that emotional immaturity and give them a little bit of power and see if they hit the switches for a nuclear bomb. No, thank you, I'll pass. I was waiting for an applause, but it's fine, okay? It's fine. It's fine, nope. I don't do courtesy applauses, it's good. It's good. It's good. It's good. Now, just this week, share this, and then, yeah, we'll be out of here. I was so encouraged by something that happened this week. I was invited to speak at a friend of mine. He goes to church here. His name is Kayron. Kayron and Seth are two friends of mine. Seth lives in my neighborhood. They both are in the military. Seth, I think, is in the Air Force. Kayron was in the Army. And they both ran security for VO. They help us. Y'all don't know this. We're more sophisticated than you think, all right? But these guys, that's what they do. So like a lot of the big events, like Atlanta Falcons games, stuff like that, K-Ron, these guys, they ran security for those events. So they know, they're like masterminds of how to do things if there's accidents or tragedies or whatever. And so he asked me, he's retiring, K-Ron is, from the military. He's in 24 years, and he's a first sergeant. And so he asked, first of all, he got in the thing, he's like, will you come do the invocation at my retirement? I was like, first of all, why are we talking about retirement? We're all kids. You know what I'm talking about? And he's like, well, we're not exactly kids, but he's like, I'm getting out because I got a whole other thing in life that I want to do. In 24 years, you can retire. And so he's retiring, and I'm like, this is great. All right. So he asked me to come, and I was like, yeah, I'm in. And Katie went with me, and so Tuesday I went to Dobbins Air Force Base. I'd never been on Dobbins, and I was laughing the whole time, just grinning, like if they only knew who I was. I'm not sure they let me on here, but I went into Dobbins, and then I was like, what is it? They're like, you have like 2 minutes, and I was like, boy, that's problematic. 2 minutes, and I was just thinking, I was like, what can I say about nonviolence in 2 minutes? What can I say about the fact that our government seems to have endless amounts of dollars to pass on to Israel to keep funding their genocide, but yet at the same time they don't seem to have any money to feed the poor? And I was like, how you put that in a 2-minute prayer? You know what I mean? Like, as I was trying to word it, I was like, now how do you put that? And so I'm writing out this prayer, and I get up and I say the prayer or whatever, and then I got down, and then there was like our friend Seth got up to speak, and I sat beside Katie and I watched, and then this first sergeant Ayers got up, and you need to know something about Kayron. He's not here today, but I mean, he is a machine if there's ever been one. Like, I mean, he's an amazing human, but he is what, like, kind of a stereotypical military guy. I mean, just shredded. You know what I'm talking about? Just like, and just so much energy, and just. He's the guy who got me running, by the way. My first half marathon, he was the one who pushed me to do it and was there waiting for me at the finish line when I was half dead. He was like, we're just getting started. And I'm like, there's something wrong with these military people, man. They're not, I mean, right in here. I mean, it takes a special person to do what they do. And so he's like, first sergeant. He's like up there in the whole thing. And he got up and he started to speak. And this room was packed with like soldiers. And I mean like soldiers. You know what I'm talking about? Like if you had like pulled up their coats, they've been loaded down with weapons. You know what I'm talking about? I'm like, these guys are like they're not just any soldiers. They're like the bad ones. Like, I mean, and bad in the good way. Like they will cut, right? And I'm just like, and I knew I was in the presence of something. I was like, oh yeah, we're here. And there's probably, I don't know, 50, 60 of them all surrounded around in this room. And Kayron gets up, and I thought, it's going to be interesting to watch how he operates, because I see him outside of the world, and then I see him in this world. It's the first time I've ever seen him in his work. And immediately he starts talking, and he just starts weeping. And then he moves over to his friend Seth, and he was like, I wouldn't be where I am today if it weren't for you. And then he moves over in front of his little baby girl, Sarai, and he starts talking to Sarai, and Katie looks over, and Katie's crying, and all of a sudden I look over, and I start seeing these military people are just weeping, and I'm like, didn't see this coming. In my mind, when I think of military, I think of, you don't show emotion. And I sat in there, and I watched Kayron just weep. And I mean, the guy just pulled his heart out. And he even acknowledged at some point in his talk, he's like, I know there's a stereotype that military people are supposed to. He's like, it would do us well to like bring some heart into what we're doing, some humanity into it. I'm like, oh my God, if we did that, imagine that. Imagine that. And then I just sat there watching him, and it occurred to me, and I walked away, and afterwards I shook his hand, and I got a photo with him, and I was like, dude, thank you for letting me be a part. It's amazing. And I realized the phrase that I walked away from. I pulled out a Dobbins, and I was like, didn't see that coming, but that was a great display of emotional maturity. Emotional maturity. Someone who didn't suppress or be embarrassed by what they felt, but simultaneously wasn't controlled by every impulse they felt in the moment. Yeah, that's it. That's it. And so I'll just kind of close with this. Jesus seems to create this space, or recognize this space, and he doesn't let it dictate his behavior, but it goes a step further, and here's where I'll close. If you notice what I said earlier, he moves from anger, and then the text uses a different word, grief. So something happens in the space. And if you can sit in it long enough, what you begin to realize is that anger, it's like it slowly begins to soften and convert into grief. It's like there's some kind of great converter in him. It's like slowly he feels his anger begin to move into grief. And it's almost like he begins to feel sorry for them. Read the story. Grief has a basic sense of feeling sympathy for someone. I might be wrong, but this may be the greatest display of emotional maturity I've ever seen. I think Jesus subtly begins to realize, oh, they're unconscious. They don't know. And slowly there seems to be some deep sense of sympathy for them. And this is where I don't know if we hang out long enough. Because it's easy to point fingers at, a previous leader of the free world and point at tweets like, you shouldn't. But I want to tell you something. I've sat and I sit long enough in that, and something subtly comes over me. And there seems to be some deep sense of sympathy going, oh, that doesn't come from anywhere. There's a long life that's been lived before this. And ultimately, what does Jesus do? He somehow uses all of that for the greater good. I want you to notice that story. You know what happens? The man's hand is healed. Jesus had a choice. It says he looks at them with anger, and then at some point in the story, he creates the space, and he realizes who he is not what he feels, and he doesn't let the emotion control the action. And then somewhere in that moment, he decides, what am I going to do with this anger? Because you got options. When you feel an emotion, you can act on that emotion in unhealthy ways or you can act on that emotion in healthy ways. And here's the thing, you get to determine, you get to define what's healthy and unhealthy. And Jesus had a choice. When he felt anger and he looked at them, he could have walked over and he could have acted on that anger in whatever way he wanted to. And, I mean, he's Jesus, so I think he has some connection with the divine. So I'm going to be real honest. I might have pulled the other trigger. I might have walked over and been like, Father, now's a good time. Take him out. There's even a moment where he's on the cross where they're like, save yourself, call down the angels. So we laugh at it, but there seems to be some evidence from the authors going, he could have. If he wanted to. There's a moment where he walks with his disciples in this village, and the village is like, we don't want your kind here. And what do the disciples go? They're like, hey, Jesus, do you want us to call down fire? That's in the Bible. And Jesus, I don't know if he laughs, but all I know is he turns around and is like, have you guys not learned anything about nonviolence? But I'm the disciple going, I hear it, but aren't there exceptions? Now's a good time to call down fire. And that would have been an epic story. And I still would have taught it as an epic story. Jesus walked in and he looked at him and he said, God, and he calls down fire and the men consume in front of his eyes and he stood back going, don't mess with me. I would buy a ticket to that movie. He doesn't. Somehow, you know what he does? He feels it, creates the space, but then walks the other direction and he heals the man with the withered hand. Here's all I'm saying. I guess it's possible that somehow you can channel your emotions for good in the world. It's like he used the fire of anger to further ignite his greater passion for good. Jesus somehow allows his anger and grief to push him into positive action. And all I can say is I know there have been moments where that has been true about me and perhaps about you. And it could be true more and more for us. Imagine if whatever you experienced, you felt, and then you begin to use that as fuel for whatever creative outlet you need to make the world a better place. I know that's been true for me in the early years. We had so many enemies, it felt like, and so much vitriol was being spit at us about this church and what we were trying to do here. And I can't tell you how bad I wanted to get online and write something. And I even had friends going, dude, you're getting slaughtered online. You could at least defend yourself. Nah, I'm good. Like, why? Not because I want to, like, some noble deal. I just tell you, it wasn't even that, because people are like, man, that's just, I'm so glad you didn't respond. It wasn't because I didn't want to. I just tell you, and I mean this quite literally, it's because I didn't have the energy to. I was utterly depleted already. If I'd had the gusto, I probably would have gotten some creative remarks, but I didn't have the energy. And now I look back going, I'm glad I didn't have the energy. I had just enough energy to get up on Sundays to do this. And so Katie and I made a conscious decision. The space was there, and we both made a conscious decision. What are you going to do? I'm going to use my energies, all this that's coming toward me, and I'm going to somehow use it as a great converter. Put a converter in your heart, and I'm going to use it as fuel to keep doing what we're doing. And you can do the same. So I'll just close here with this quote. I love this. One writer said this: anger can be a fuel. You've heard that. Like, you use anger for, yeah, anger can be a fuel. You need fuel to launch a rocket. Love that. I like to think of Vinings Lake as launching a rocket. But if all you have is fuel without any complex internal mechanism directing it, you don't have a rocket, you have a bomb. So, people, let's not implode. Let's not explode. What if we funneled everything we are feeling right now? Hang with me. Everything. All that you're feeling. And I know you're like, I'm all kinds of emotional. I know, me too. I live in America. It's 2024. I'm feeling it all. Not feeling very good about anything I'm seeing right now, to be honest with you, with the exception of this small group that I keep meeting with. I actually really feel good about you people. You encourage me. You help me. You keep me from diving into the depths of cynicism. What if we took all of our emotion and we somehow bottled it up and we used it to light a fuse and blast a rocket off to Mableton and just see where this thing goes? I'm telling you, I think it's possible. And as the rocket just blasts, there's a lot of things you could say about it, but maybe one is this. Good God. The way they handled their emotions. I salute that. That's impressive. That's a person who knows something about emotional maturity. All right. Hopefully that's helpful to you. And if you have kids, hopefully